Imagine you're in labour. No hospital, no doctor, no epidural. Just you, a dirt floor, and a group of women who've buried more babies than they've raised. There's no clock counting the hours, no monitor tracking a heartbeat. If something goes wrong, there is no ambulance coming. There is only what the people around you know how to do with their hands. And whatever herbs, positions and prayers have been passed down from women who faced the exact same moment and didn't all walk away from it. This wasn't a bad birth. This was every birth for most of human history. And here's the uncomfortable math. For most of our species' existence, giving birth was one of the leading causes of death for adult women. Some estimates put maternal mortality in prehistoric and pre-modern populations as high as 1 in 20 births, not once in a lifetime. Every single time a woman gave birth, she was rolling those odds again. If you think intelligence and instinct were enough to get through that, you're wrong. Survival required something colder, something closer to triage than tenderness. And today, we're going to walk through exactly what that meant, because some of it is going to be difficult to hear. Let's set the scene first, because you need to understand why this was so dangerous in the first place. The human pelvis is a compromise and not a comfortable one. Somewhere around 2 million years ago, our ancestors started walking upright on narrow, efficient hips built for covering long distances on 2 legs. At almost the same time, evolution started favouring bigger brains, which meant bigger skulls. Those two changes are in direct conflict. A pelvis narrow enough for efficient walking and a skull large enough to carry a human brain do not fit together easily. Anthropologists actually have a name for this. They call it the obstetrical dilemma. Every human birth, biologically speaking, is a tight squeeze through a passage that was never generously designed for it. No other primate on Earth has it this hard. Chimpanzees give birth in minutes with minimal risk. Humans can labour for days, and the outcome was never guaranteed, so our ancestors weren't dealing with occasional bad luck. They were dealing with a structural built-in danger that came with being human at all. Which brings us to the first genuinely dark survival strategy, one most people have never even considered. Birth spacing enforced by starvation, not choice. In many hunter-gatherer societies, women breastfed their children for 3 to 4 years. That's far longer than most mothers today. And it wasn't gentle, attachment-style parenting. It was population control, whether people understood the biology or not. Extended breastfeeding suppresses ovulation. In a world with no reliable food surplus, spacing births out by years wasn't a lifestyle preference. It was often the only thing standing between a family and starvation. A mother carrying 1 infant who couldn't yet walk was already stretched to her limit during a migration or a lean season. A mother with 2 was in serious danger of losing both, and herself along with them. So the body did the math the mind couldn't always bring itself to do. And when the body didn't do it fast enough, people did it instead. Here's where it gets darker. Infanticide. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence, and this is genuinely painful to sit with, points to infanticide as a documented practice across numerous ancient and traditional societies, particularly in cases involving twins, visible birth defects, or a birth that landed in the middle of a famine. Anthropologists studying groups like the Kung of the Kalahari and the Ach of Paraguay have recorded practices where a newborn's survival depended entirely on resources the group simply didn't have to spare. A second infant arriving too soon after the first, in a group already living at the edge of what the land could support, wasn't treated as a tragedy to be mourned quietly. It was arithmetic. 1 small life weighed against the survival of an entire family that depended on the mother continuing to walk, forage, and produce milk for the child she already had. And this wasn't rare, isolated panic in a crisis. In some studied traditional societies, infanticide rates for specific circumstances, twins especially, have been recorded as high as 40 to 50%. 2 infants born at once meant 2 mouths a body could not physically feed, and 2 sets of arms a mother did not have. This pattern shows up far beyond hunter-gatherer bands too. In ancient Sparta, infants judged too weak to become future soldiers were, according to historical accounts, exposed on a hillside. In ancient Rome, a newborn wasn't even legally considered a person until the father physically lifted the child from the ground in a ritual called tollere liberum. Until that moment, the decision to keep or abandon the infant was entirely his, and exposure of unwanted infants, particularly girls, was documented and, in some periods, unremarkable. Now let's talk about the birth itself, because even reaching that decision required surviving the delivery in the first place, and delivery alone could kill you. Skeletal remains from sites across Europe and Asia show evidence of pelvic trauma consistent with obstructed labour, injuries that, without surgical intervention, are fatal for the mother, the child, or both. There was no cesarean section available to most of human history. There was no way to reposition a breech baby using imaging and steady, trained hands in a sterile room. There was a birth attendant, usually another woman who had already survived labour herself, working entirely by feel in the dark, sometimes for days at a time, with nothing but her hands and whatever she'd learned from watching other births go right and wrong. Bioarchaeologists have uncovered something even harder to look at directly. Mothers and infants buried together, the child's remains positioned in a way that suggests it died during or immediately after delivery, still tangled with the mother's body. These aren't isolated one-off tragedies scattered through the record. They're a pattern repeated across thousands of years of human burial sites on multiple continents. Before modern obstetrics existed, a difficult birth didn't just risk one life, it risked two, often enough that entire cultures built belief systems, rituals and taboos, specifically around trying to prevent it. Which brings us to the psychological pivot, because ancient people were not ignorant of any of this. They understood the danger with total clarity, and they built entire systems trying to survive it. In ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts, women in labour were surrounded by protective charms, specific birthing postures, and attendants whose entire role was managing hemorrhage, positioning, and pain. Primitive ancestors of practices modern medicine still uses today. Squatting births, supported births using ropes or the arms of other women. Birthing stools carved from stone found at archaeological sites and depicted in ancient Egyptian reliefs. These weren't superstition dressed up as medicine. They were medicine, built empirically generation after generation, by women watching other women live or die and trying to figure out through trial and devastating error what actually worked. And when none of it worked, some societies developed something darker still. An early brutal ancestor of what we now call a post-mortem caesarean, a procedure performed not to save the mother because it was already too late for her, but to attempt to save the child in her final moments. Roman law is often cited as one of the earliest sources requiring this exact procedure be attempted on any woman who died in late pregnancy, not out of compassion for her, but because a child, even one still inside its dead mother, was believed to hold legal and religious status that demanded it be given a chance at life and at burial. Here's the mirror, and it's an uncomfortable one. We look at ancient infanticide and we think barbaric. We look at ancient birth practices and we think primitive. But every decision these people made was the same decision we still make today, just dressed in different clothes and pushed further out of sight. Resources are still finite. Survival is still never fully guaranteed. Someone still has to choose who gets fed, who gets treated, who gets a chance, and who doesn't. We've just outsourced that choice to hospitals, insurance systems, and medical triage protocols instead of making it around a fire with our own hands, in full view of the consequences. Even the aftermath of birth carried danger our ancestors had to manage constantly. Postpartum hemorrhage, infection from an unsterile delivery, a mother too weak to produce milk, all of it meant the danger didn't end when the baby was born. It just changed shape. Some cultures developed the practice of wet nursing specifically to survive this, other women in the community stepping in to feed an infant whose mother had died or couldn't produce enough milk herself, another form of the same cooperation that lets small human groups survive brutal winters and long famines. A child without a living mother wasn't automatically a child without hope, as long as the group around that child was willing to share what it had. Tonight, when you hear about a birth in a bright hospital room with monitors tracking every heartbeat, with a surgeon on call the moment anything goes wrong, remember what that same event cost for most of human history. It cost mothers their lives at a rate we would call a full-scale humanitarian crisis, if it happened anywhere in the world today. It cost some infants their lives before they'd taken a single breath by human hands, not out of cruelty, but because there was no other option that kept the rest of the group alive. Every single person you've ever met, everyone you love, everyone who has ever loved you, is descended from someone who survived that lottery. Generation after generation, against odds that would terrify us today, until slowly, and only very recently in the story of our species, those odds finally started tilting in our favour.